Hello and welcome to our webinar, 3 Ways to Improve the Odds of Your Agile Transformation, hosted by Pluralsight author Jeremy Jarrell. I'm Lindsay Locke from Pluralsight, and I'd like to take a minute to tell you what to expect within the next hour. First, I'd like to draw your attention to the chat box in your webinar control panel. Jeremy will be answering questions at the end of the webinar, so please submit your questions to the chat box during the presentation. Be sure to tweet about your experience today with our hashtag PluralsightLive, as we'll be choosing a winner at random for a free month of training with Pluralsight. After you exit the webinar, you'll be prompted to take a short survey. We'd love to hear from you, so please take a few minutes to complete it. This webinar will be recorded, and we'll email you the link in a few days. And with that, thank you for joining us. Let's welcome Jeremy.
Hello. Thank you all for joining me, and thank you, Lindsay, for that great introduction. My name, once again, is Jeremy Jarrell, and I want to take a little bit of time today to talk to you about improving the odds of your Agile transformation. Now, before we get started, just want to tell you a little bit about myself. I'm an Agile coach, a software engineer, and a Pluralsight author. And I've actually been lucky enough to be involved in a lot of Agile transformations, both as a team member, a coach, or simply an advisor to other teams. So through this experience, I've had the opportunity to see a lot of teams really succeed with their Agile transformation, and unfortunately some of those teams fail. Now, one of the things I've learned through this is that while there really is no perfect recipe for creating a high-performing Agile team because, well, every organization and every culture is going to be different, there actually were some commonalities between the teams that succeeded and those that didn't. Now, your situation is going to be unique, but following some of those common practices definitely improve your odds. So what were those practices? Well, honestly, there were lots, but there's 3 specific ones that I want to talk about today. Now, I picked these 3 based on my own experiences with teams of seeing what succeeded and what didn't, as well as how many times that these particular practices seem to come up in the Scrum literature again and again as indicators for success for high-performing teams. Before we get into the practices, though, I want to take a few minutes just to introduce you to some of the terms I'll be using, just in case you haven't worked with Scrum before. It'll make things a little easier to follow. The first is a story. Scrum teams work in units of work called stories. Now, stories could be features, bugs, enhancements, whatever, but just know that for the purposes today, whenever I'm referring to a story, I'm simply talking about a piece of work that a team is tackling. The next is a sprint. The sprints are fixed time boxes in which a Scrum team tries to plan, develop, and deliver something that's useful to the customer. Often sprints are 2 weeks, but it's not uncommon to see sprints anywhere between 1 week or 1 month in duration. And the last term I want to talk about is velocity. Velocity is quite simply how much work a Scrum team completes in a sprint. Now, velocity is measured in points, days, ideal days, tomatoes, whatever. It really doesn't matter what the unit of the velocity is, as long as it's something that the team is comfortable with and we agree upon it. So with that out of the way, let's talk about the practices. The first practice we like to look for when we look at teams and how they improve is, are the stories that they're picking up ready to cook? And what ready to cook basically means is that a team should be ready, a story should be ready for the team to work on as soon as the team picks them up. Now, I'm actually borrowing this phrase from my friend Nivea Henry, who's a great Agile coach in Pittsburgh, because I love how she uses it to paint the picture of what we're really looking for in a story before we pick it up. So what makes a story ready to cook? Well, some of the things we look at is the title of the story clear? Is it not ambiguous? So when we look at the title of the story, the point should be obvious. We want to avoid unclear language like look into this or think about what would happen if, and instead we want titles that are immediately actionable like add the ability to or fix the error that occurs when. We also want as many questions answered about the story as possible before we start work on it. Now, these could be questions about what the customer wants from the story or even how we'll approach it technically. We want to nail these down because oftentimes development teams will pick up a story that there's still a lot of unknown with, and we'll spend a significant amount of the sprint just trying to get questions answered so we understand how to start. Not only is this not really a great use of the development team's time, but often developers in the org don't really have the connections to dig into their organization and get some of these questions answered. So as many of these things as we can rule out and kind of nail down before the team picks them up, the sooner the team will be able to hit the ground running as soon as they pick up the story. And lastly, we want to look at stories that have a clear end goal. This means we can tell obviously from the story what we are trying to accomplish, and how do we know when we got there? This one's important, so we'll come back to this one a little bit. So how do we know when the story is ready to be worked on? Well, we're actually lucky because Scrum gives us a tool called Invest that helps us get them there. Now, Invest is simply just an acronym that captures 6 ideal qualities that we like to see in stories before we start them. Let's walk through them in a bit, and then we'll see them in context of a real story. The first one is independent. We want stories that can be worked on without needing to depend on other stories. Now, this doesn't mean stories can't have prerequisites. Prerequisite stories are completely fine. But what we want is once a prerequisite story is complete, then this story should be able to stand on its own. What we want to avoid is a team having to jump back and forth between 2 stories that are in progress at the same time just to get a feature finished. Instead, we want to be able to complete a prerequisite story, wrap it up entirely, and then move on entirely to the next story. Not only do we want stories to be independent because it makes them easier to understand and therefore it makes it easier for the team to estimate, but also this gives us the ability to move the story around in the backlog a little easier without having to worry about what other stories need to come with it. We want stories to be negotiable. This means that there's room in the story for a developer to decide how to best approach it once they pick it up. What this means is that we want to avoid any overly specific language or details in the story, and we want to focus on the high-level end goal of the story instead of the implementation. Now, it's not uncommon to have a few hints in the story of here's where you may want to start or here's what you may think about, but we really want to leave the approach to how we best implement a story up to a developer, because once the developer picks it up, they'll know more about what the best choice is than anyone who's ever written the story. So we want to leave a little bit of negotiation room in there for the developer to use to choose that path that makes the most sense to them. We want stories to be valuable. This means that we're not simply throwing stories at a team as busy work while we plan our next move. We want every story to make a meaningful impact to the product, and we want them to provide value to the customer. Now, in some cases, this may not be direct value. For example, if the story is maybe a technical prerequisite for another customer-facing story, that's okay, but it should be obvious for us to look at the story and understand how that eventually gets to adding value. A good rule of thumb here is to look at all the stories the team is currently working on and just ask ourselves, is this the most important thing that the team should be working on right now? If we can't answer yes, then it's probably time that we rethink about how we choose our valuable stories. We want stories to be estimatable. And this one's simple. It just means we understand the story well enough that the team can give a reasonable estimate to it. It means the story is clear, it's small enough, and we have enough of it we can hold it in our head that we can understand, that we think how big of a problem this really will be. We want stories to be sized appropriately. This means that stories are big enough that they make an impact, but they're not so big that they can't be understood. As stories become bigger, they get harder to understand, and then they can become harder to estimate. Instead, we want to prefer small stories, and kind of the Goldilocks type story that we're looking for is a story that's just big enough to make an impact to a product, but no bigger. That's our just right size. As a matter of fact, a lot of teams when they first start working with Invest will simply replace the sized appropriately bullet with small to constantly remind them that we really want to err towards small stories. And we want stories to be testable. This means we can understand to know how we finish the story or if we finish the story. This also means the story is in a testable state. Now, we may need dummy data, we may need scaffolding code to get it there, but that's okay as long as we're just making integration points with the story rather than the story itself. And we also remember that at this point, we're really only testing the end result of the story, not the implementation. Now, all this criteria probably seems a little bit abstract when I just talk about it out of context, so let's look at an example. Imagine we're building a sales management application. And the first story is, well, we want salespeople to be able to access the product. So we write the story as, let salespeople access the product. Let's take our first story and see how it holds up against Invest. So is this story independent? Well, when you think about it, it really isn't, because there's a lot boiled into here that we don't really understand. So, for example, yes, salespeople access the product, but how do they log in? How do they get accounts in the first place? Can they register accounts themselves, or do they need to be invited by a manager? There's a lot we don't know. Let's keep things simple, and for this story, we'll assume they already have accounts, and we'll just add stories later to let them either be invited by their manager or register themselves. As a result, we're going to focus this story on simply letting the salesperson log into the product. So if we look at this, now the story becomes independent because we're focusing on one specific piece of the workflow. Yes, there are prerequisites. We need to understand how the salesperson gets an account in the first place, but looking at this story as a self-contained unit of work, it becomes much easier for us to understand. How about negotiable? Is this story negotiable? Well, yes, it is, because we only specify what the end result of the story should be. We're not really specifying how the developer should implement that goal. We've only asked the developer to give us the ability to add a login screen to the for the salesperson. We haven't really overspecified how they get there. So this gives the developer a little bit of room to breathe to figure out what's the best path to follow, both for the product and for the technology stack they'll be working with. How about valuable? I think this one is pretty valuable because, to be frank, without it, users can't access the system. So if we apply our rule of thumb, is this the most important thing a team should be working on right now? Yes, I think it is. What about estimatable? Yes, it's familiar because most developers have already built a login screen, so we have prior knowledge to work on. This story is also smaller than it was previously because when we looked at giving users access to the system, that really wasn't estimatable because there was a lot of unknown built in that. But simply asking us to create a password login screen is. And like we said, most developers have built an innumerable number of password login screens in their account, so not only is this a small story, but they have reference, they have prior knowledge to build on. So this guy, now that we've sliced him into simply the ability to provide a login, he's become much more estimatable. Is this one sized appropriately? Well, once again, it is because we've made it smaller than it was previously. The original story was too big, but this one becomes a little bit more reasonable that we can bite it off in a sprint. Well, a good rule of thumb here is that we want a story that is small enough that a developer can hold it in their head at once. That means that we can understand the points where the story ends, the story begins, kind of think of them all at once, and think about the details. That's a good test to understand whether or not a story is just the right size or if it's too big and needs to be split further. So how about testable? I think the story is really testable because we have a clear end state with this. Either the user was able to log into the system or they weren't. Now remember that we didn't handle how the user gets an account in the first place, so this one is actually a great example of where we'd need to use dummy data, such as manually adding a user to our database first. But that's okay because it lets us test this story, and how the user gets in the database in the first place, it's not the point of this story. This story isn't about how a user gets an account, it's only about how we log in after they have one. We'll handle creating the user account in another story, and because we went through this process in the first place, we've highlighted that that's something we didn't consider and it needs to be accounted for. So yeah, this guy is very testable. So Invest gives us a real nice set of criteria to evaluate stories, but it's not perfect. You probably noticed that there's some overlap. So for example, small stories tend to be more estimatable and they also tend to be easier to test. That's actually a good thing because it creates a virtuous circle in which improving one aspect of Invest tends to improve others. Another common theme that you probably saw is that a lot of this criteria can be improved simply by making the story smaller. Now, not all attributes are going to apply to all stories though. So for example, some stories may become so small they're not negotiable, and we also want to be aware that we don't make stories so small that they're simply not valuable anymore. We want to look at Invest as a guidepost to help us keep a story between the lines of what we consider a good story that's ready to go, instead of a hard set of rules that we need to apply blindly to every single story. Now, applying all of this criteria to every single story in your backlog probably seems a little overwhelming, but luckily we don't have to. The secret is that we don't actually apply Invest to everything in our backlog. We only do to the stories that are just about ready for the team to pick up in their next sprint. And one reason we do this is that we don't know enough about the stories further down the backlog, so we wouldn't really do a very good job about that anyway. What invest helps us, though, is it helps us tell stories that aren't ready to be worked on from those that aren't. If we have a story near the top of our backlog that we think our developers will be picking up in the next sprint, and we can't really get the invest criteria around us, that's a good red flag that this story isn't ready and it's just going to slow our developers down. So we either need to push it off to another sprint, or we need to think about what we need to do to get it there so the team can hit the ground running when they pick it up. So I've talked about backlogs several times, but it wasn't something I defined at the beginning. So let's take a little time to talk about it now. The list of stories that our team is slated to work on is simply called our backlog. Now backlogs are prioritized, so the most important stories are at the top, and those are the stories we'll be working on next. And then stories become less urgent as we walk down the backlog towards the bottom. Now I want to take a second and call out that I use the word urgent here, and that's intentional. A lot of times when working with customers or stakeholders, you want to avoid using the word important in this context because that draws us to stories become less important as we walk down the backlog. And a lot of times in a customer's eyes, every story is important. So however we simply describe things as urgent, that makes things a little easier because it better communicates that this is more of a sense of priority, and we're not necessarily instilling that this particular story is less important than the others. It's just a little change in the nomenclature, but it can save you a little bit of pain down the road. So backlogs, just like stories, have a set of criteria that we use to identify whether or not our backlog is healthy. The one for backlogs that we use is actually called DEEP. So DEEP is just an acronym that captures the qualities that we consider a good backlog. So let's talk about DEEP. We want a backlog to be detailed appropriately. This means that stories near the top of the backlog, which we'll be working on sooner, should be very well defined or should meet our invest criteria. Stories further down the backlog that we won't be working on as soon really don't need to be. As a matter of fact, we actually want to leave those stories lower in the backlog, a little less defined for now, for two reasons. One is that we don't really know enough about them yet, and we'll probably know more about them as we work their way up. So we want to hold applying this criteria about them to them until we have a better idea of what the story is really going to mean. The other reason is that a lot of these stories in the bottom of the backlog, no matter how important they seem to us today, may never be worked on. Priorities will change, schedules will change, changes in the marketplace will drive new priorities, and a lot of these stories that are now sitting at the bottom of the backlog may change or just get removed entirely. So since there's a lot of churn in the bottom of the backlog, we don't want to waste time applying this criteria to a story that we never see the light of day. The best case scenario is that we've simply wasted effort on stories that we'll never work on. The worst case scenario is that we spend a lot of effort defining a story that we've later decided is unimportant, but we can't quite bring ourselves to let go because we've already invested all this time in defining it, so the team ends up working on a story that no one needs simply because we see it as a sunk cost. So to avoid this, we really avoid talking too much about the stories at the backlog at the bottom anyway. If they're important, they'll work their way up to the top. We want stories to be estimated. This means that each story we work on needs to have some sort of a rough estimate. And yeah, this even includes those that aren't well defined. Now, we do this because estimating the stories, even if it's just a very rough ballpark estimate, helps us with prioritization because it helps us weigh the cost of each story against its benefits. A lot of stories sound great until we figure out how much they're going to cost to do, and then they lose a lot of their luster. Having even just a ballpark estimate on these stories helps us identify that sooner rather than later. We also, because we know the stories at the bottom will be less well defined, we're going to accept that the estimates are going to be less accurate as we work our way down the backlog, and that's okay. And one thing I tell teams as well is that there's always a lot of apprehension of estimating every story in the backlog. Don't spend a lot of time on this. In fact, I'll often tell teams spend no more than 2 minutes on every story to arrive at the estimate. We just need a good enough estimate, and don't be married to that estimate because we'll have a chance to apply a better estimate and think through it a little bit more if we decide to pick that story up for sprint planning. We want backlogs to be emergent, and this just means that the backlog changes over the course of a project. The backlog is a living animal to us. It's not just a document we define once and put in a closet. So a lot of the stories will change, some will add it, and a lot of these will be removed, especially as we move down to the bottom of the backlog. You can expect more churn. And as I mentioned before, this is one reason why we don't spend a lot of time really well defining these stories in the lower end of the backlog, because we know the backlog is going to be so emergent throughout the course of a project. And finally, we want backlogs to be prioritized. That means the most important work is at the top, and the less urgent is at the bottom. As we walk down the backlog, we want to pretend the project is shopped. So do this as an exercise. We'll walk down our backlog, and we'll just imagine that today the project stopped and we have to ship what we have. Are we happy with everything above us that we shipped? How about is there anything below us that we wish we'd shipped instead? If there's something below that we look at and say, wow, I really wish that had been in there, then it's time we need to rethink about our priorities in the backlog and move those stories up so they would be in it if the product had to ship. Now, we've talked a bit already about understanding what the goal of a story is, as well as knowing whether or not we actually hit it. So how do we know when a story is complete? Well, a great way to do it is simply to work with the customer before starting to really define and understand what the story looks like when it's done. Now, luckily, the next practice we'll talk about takes care of this. The done means done practice just lets us define what our story looks like when it's done, and we do this by asking the customer a few questions to capture their answer and kind of understand what they're thinking about the story. Now, you'll probably have to experiment to find the best set of questions that work best for both you and your customers. But here's a few examples to get you started just to help you understand what type of information we're after when we define our criteria. A great question to start with is just, what is the goal? So what are we trying to accomplish with this story? Or, what should the user be able to do when we're done? Asking what the user should be able to do when we're done often helps us understand the end game of the story a little better so we know what we're shooting for. We also want to know if there's corner cases or exceptions we need to worry about. Now, there's always going to be corner cases, but how many can we think of now? And we want to do this because we want to understand, do we need to handle these as part of this story, or do we need to carve them off to a later story? Oftentimes, even though we've come up with these corner cases and exceptions, we decide that we don't really need to handle them now and they can be dealt with later. And I want to clarify too, when I say later, I'm not necessarily talking about like, oh, we'll hold this off until a later version. But maybe this may just happen in another sprint, but is it something that has to be done to complete this story? And we want to understand what the story will not do. Now this one's really important because it helps us define our boundaries. Knowing the boundaries help the customer and the development team understand what we're trying to do and whether or not it will be enough to meet our needs. If these boundaries aren't clearly defined, both the customer and the development team tend to make assumptions about what they really are, and when these assumptions don't line up, we start to get in trouble. So we want to have a good understanding of where this story stops at the beginning so there's no surprises at the end. Now, agreeing on all this ahead of time gives the team a clear goal to shoot for. It also dramatically increases the chance that the customer is going to accept the story once it's shown to them. In fact, we call all this together acceptance criteria. Now, does this mean, or defining all this mean, that we can't change our mind on a story? No, it really doesn't at all. And actually, one of the reasons we do Agile planning like we do is that it makes us very adaptive to changing situations. However, when we look at the reality of the situation, what we find is that stories are rejected much more often simply for the customer and the development team misunderstanding what the point of the story was rather than the customer changing their mind just in the middle of the development. So if we can shake out and reduce as many of those misunderstandings as possible, that frees us up to focus on the chances where we do have a change of mind or we do find a better way to do something while we're building a story. Now, acceptance criteria tends to emerge from conversations with the customer. A lot of this won't really emerge until the story is the most defined or just before it gets worked on. And one of the things we look at is oftentimes a story's size is actually determined more by the details and corner cases than the overall goal. So the better we understand the acceptance criteria, the better we can understand the story size when we're thinking about our estimate. So that's why we like to do this close to when a story is getting ready to be picked up. Now, this is probably making a lot more sense if we see it in action. So let's take an example based on our story about a salesperson logging in again. So let's talk about some of the questions that we might ask the customer as we build this story out. One might be, what happens if the salesperson logs in? And the salesperson might say, oh, after he logs in, the salesperson goes to their dashboard. This one's nice because it helps us establish our goal, and it helps us understand exactly what a testable state for this story would be. We know that after a successful login, the salesperson goes to the dashboard. That's easy and that's simple. Well, but that also begs the question, what happens if the user misses their password? Because I kind of just assumed they would type their password correctly there. What if they mistype it? How many tries do they get? Do they go on forever? Do we lock them out? And the customer might look at this and say, we'll give them 3 tries before the account's locked out. driving some of these questions helps us flesh out some of the corner cases and the exceptions we need to worry about and what happens when the user strays from the happy path. But this one also begs the question that this means the user needs to know how to reset their password. So are we doing this as part of this story, or is this something we can carve off? And the customer might think about this again and say, you know what? We don't really need reset password for this particular story, so we can do it in the next sprint. Sure, we might need it before this whole product is released. It isn't really something that we want to lock an account in version 1 and then not offer a password reset to version 2. That probably is an idea, or maybe it's a great business model. I don't know. But what we want to do, just because we've set something off, it doesn't mean that it's not going to happen for some time. It just means we might handle this in the next sprint, and it's not important for the story we have now. But understanding what we can slice off and what we need to handle now helps us understand our boundaries. And like I said, this helps us understand where the customer thinks the story ends, and we think the story ends, so we're in agreement. Now, a couple of things you may have noticed about this. One, a lot of these questions tend to chain. Even if you don't think that you have a lot of questions to start the conversation at first, you'll find as you start talking to the customer about what happens when, what happens then, it tends to beget more questions, and that's where a lot of your criteria will come from. And that's why I say acceptance criteria tends to really emerge from the conversation rather than having a predefined set of questions that we go with. Another thing you notice is that acceptance criteria is very specific and it's easily measured. So for example, each of these cases, it's going to be obvious whether we hit it or not. In the first case, it's going to be very obvious that did the user log in, did they hit the dashboard or not? If they didn't, then we didn't quite get this criteria right. Or can they try their account more than 3 times? Once again, this is very simple and it's very binary. And whether or not password reset is there is also very obvious. We want acceptance criteria, although it tends to be very simple because it tends to be very small, to be very specific, so it's really easy for us to tell whether or not a developer hit it. But defining how we know a story is done doesn't have to just stop with the customer. So how many times have you heard developers say, oh, this story is done, but it still needs to be tested? Or maybe, oh, we just still need to wrap it in a few more unit tests. Or we just need to review it as a team. Or it just needs to be added to the build script so we can get it into the staging environment. Whatever the reason is, if you hear, oh, the story is all done except, then it's really not done. So instead what we need to do is talk with the team and decide what it means for a story to be done. That means we sit down as a team and think about what's important to us that we can sign off on a story being complete. Now, this might be the story has unit tests, it's been peer reviewed, or maybe it's even been deployed to a staging environment. Whatever the criteria is that you pick as a team, simply decide on it and agree on it as a team so you can stick with it together. We call this together done criteria, and it's great because it keeps us honest as a team, and it helps us avoid stories that claim to be done but really aren't. A good way to get started is to choose criteria that represents past problems you've run into. So for example, let's imagine you have a lot of duplicated code from new developers coming in. Using peer reviews would be a great way to catch that as part of your done criteria. Maybe a more senior developer can review the code of a junior developer and say, oh, I see you implemented this password hashing function. We actually already have this over here. Why don't we just use this instead? Or maybe you've noticed that a lot of the new changes you're making tend to keep breaking old code. So maybe your done criteria is, well, the newer code has at least some level of unit tests. Now that may not help the old code, but at least will stake down the behavior of the new code moving forward. So when it becomes the old code, it's less likely to be broken as we build things on top of it. Whatever the criteria you start with is, or the criteria you choose, it helps if you figure out something that scratches an itch that your team is currently facing. That'll make it a little bit easier for the team to stick with and understand why they need to do it. Now the last practice I want to talk about is just keeping teams together once they're formed. Now teams can form instantly. We just need to put a few people in a room, give them a project, and let them go. But teams take a lot of time to gel. And each time the team goes through this process or goes through the forming process, they go through the same steps over and over again, which we call forming, storming, norming, and performing. So let's look at these stages so you'll understand a little bit more about what I mean. The forming stage, where teams start, is when teams first start filling each other out. Now this is the polite stage where people tend to be very polite and friendly to each other, and they're really trying not to upset each other. This one doesn't last very long. After the forming stage, we tend to go into the storming stage. Now the storming stage is when teams have gotten to know and gotten to trust each other a little bit. So the gloves start to come off. You start to see team members start to challenge each other's opinions, which can be a good thing. And you see conflict start to arise between the team, which can be good or not, depending on how we handle it and how we channel it. Now, if the team makes it to the storming stage, they get to norming. Norming is when we see the team first really start to gel. This is when a lot of the major disagreements are resolved, and people start to fall into normal routines that they can work with. And the last stage for the teams to get there is the performing stage. This is where teams are on fire. They know how to work together and pretty much manage themselves. Now, there is conflict on the team, but it's productive conflict and it solves problems. And to be honest, few teams ever really get here, but for those that do, they're amazingly productive. Now, all teams go through this process, or at least as far as they get into the process, but it can take a long time. The real problem that we run into is that every time we change a team, we reset this process back to the beginning. Teams vary on how fast they go through the process, so we want to be patient and give the team time to gel before we decide it's simply not working and break them up again to start the whole process over. Now, it varies, but most teams can take anywhere between 2 to 4 sprints to really start to gel, so I'd recommend giving a team at least that much time before you decide they're not working and starting them back at square one. So let's look at an example. Let's imagine that Joe, Steve, and Susan are all working really, really well together. They've been together for a while. They've progressed through all 4 stages and are actually one of those rare high-performing teams. But then Michael joins. Now, we've only increased the team size by 1, but for all intents and purposes, it really is a new team, so we have to go through the whole forming, storming, norming, and performing process all over again. Now, it may be quicker this time because it was only a small change in the team, but it's still going to take time, and it's something we need to be aware of. Also, what's more important is that there's no guarantee that the team will ever get back to performing. Now, I want to call out here, this may not mean that Michael is a jerk. Michael may be a really nice guy, but every time we introduce a new team member, it changes the dynamics and the culture of the team. Maybe Michael's a great guy, but his sense of humor just rubs Steve the wrong way. Or maybe Michael was Susan's manager in a former position, and that just creates a weird dynamic between them. Whatever the reason is, understand that every time we change a team, we start them back over, and we need to know whether or not they're going to make it to the end. So instead, what we want to do is once we get a team to the right size, we leave them alone and let them perform. So this always begs the question, what is the right size for a team? Well, the rule of thumb that we use in Scrum is 7 plus or minus 2, or somewhere between 5 and 9. And why we say this is that because for any teams that are less than 5, they tend to be too small to get any real meaningful work done without outside help. Now, what that means is that a lot of times while they can still get small projects done, they really have to lean on external members or other dependent teams to get bigger things done. And we want to limit the amount of time that a team needs to take on another team as a dependency because that puts a lot of things out of their control, brings a lot of risk into that team. Instead, we want to build teams in a way that they can do as much as possible without outside help. And teams less than 5 honestly usually can't do that. But when teams get more than 9, they get too big. They're too big to self-manage, and honestly, the team will have so much work in process at that point that it's really hard for them to get anything done without stepping on each other's toes. Now, before I move on, I want to clarify one point here. When I say 7 plus or minus 2, I'm not just talking about software engineers or coders. In Scrum, when we think of a Scrum team or development team, we think of all members of the team who are contributing to that product as members of the team or as developers. So when I say 7 plus or minus 2, I'm counting engineers, I'm counting testers, I'm counting DBAs, designers, anyone who's an individual contributor to that project. Now, if your team happens to be on the high side, say 7, hopefully they're not just engineers, because what you'll find is that it's really hard to keep 7 software engineers busy without them getting in each other's way. As a matter of fact, if we have a choice, we actually like to err on the side of smaller teams. Smaller teams are easier to self-manage, and because they simply can't tackle as much work at once because they have a natural limit of their capacity, planning becomes a lot easier for that team, and they're less likely to step on each other's toes and get in each other's way. As a matter of fact, a lot of the really recent research that we have really drives us toward the thinking that 5 is really the optimal team size for what we do in the technology industry. Now, I've thrown a little bit of management theory at you as far as like what the proper team size is and what the composition of that team is. But that's a little heavy, so I want to leave you with one little simpler rule before we go, and that's the 2 pizza rules. Now this comes from Jeff Bezos, who is the CEO of Amazon. And Jeff Bezos is famous for his 2 pizza rules, which basically says that any team that can't be fed with 2 pizzas is too big and has to be broken up. Now, although this one is a lot less specific than the Harvard Business School idea of optimal teams and the Scrum 7 plus or minus 2 rule, I really like this one because it's a lot easier to remember and it's much more tangible. It's a lot easier for people to look at their team and simply have a gut feel of, yeah, this team needs more than 2 pizzas. It's probably too big for us. But there's one other key difference I want to call out here. What's really interesting about this rule compared to the other ones is that there's no lower bound on teams. This only points to how big a team can get. It doesn't say how small it can be, which tells us that, at least in the Amazon culture, small teams can actually be quite productive if they're cut up in a way that they can really produce work by themselves. So that's a good thing to keep in mind and a good thing to wonder why we can't get there moving forward. So we know the practices that we need. So where do we go from here? A good place to start is to look at the next stories that your team is getting ready to pick up and see what it takes to get them to the invest criteria. Do those stories meet invest criteria? If not, what would it take to get them there? Now remember, we don't have to do this for every story in the backlog, just the ones that are just right up next to be worked on. And I would actually even say, even if that seems overwhelming, let's imagine that you tend to pick up 6 stories a sprint, just pick 3. Pick your top 3, put them through the invest criteria, and see how well defined you can get them before the team starts. Then that's a really good test after you start working to see what the difference is between those stories. Were those first 3 much more productive? Did the team seem they hit the ground running? I think you'll be pretty surprised at the results when you compare the stories that were well defined versus the ones that just happened to float to the top of the backlog. The other thing I'll call out here is that we know from a lot of our research and a lot of our literature that this is actually the single most important thing a Scrum team can do to improve their productivity. Having well-defined stories makes a bigger difference in how well a Scrum team performs than anything else that we touch. So the invest criteria helps us get there. Once we've looked at the invest criteria, think about what it would take to define each story's acceptance criteria with the customer. Then simply ask, what would it take to consider this story done? Now, you may miss some things, and some things will fall through the cracks, but that's okay. The goal is not to get perfect acceptance criteria defined for every single story at the outset. The goal is to simply get in the habit of start thinking about each story's end game once you start to work on it. We want to, as Stephen Covey would say, we want to begin each story with the end in mind because that tells us where we're going. And sit down with the team and talk about as a team what it would take for you to consider it done. Do stories need unit tests? Do they need peer reviews? Whatever it is, write it down, hang it up, and try to stick to it for all stories in that sprint. Once the sprint's over, look back at the criteria and talk about it. Was there anything missing, or was there anything that really didn't seem that important after you decided it was? Use what you learn each sprint to keep refining your done criteria until you find something that works for you. Now, when you're recording your done criteria, I want to call out you want to avoid a formal document. Please don't put it in a wiki. Please don't type it up and print it out. Just simply handwrite the criteria down on a piece of paper. Having the criteria handwritten and just hung on the wall helps reinforce to the team that done criteria is malleable, and we can change it if we find out we missed something or if it's just not working to us. Once we start to put things in an electronic tool or we start to print out nice, very, very formatted printed documents, it starts to imply formality to the team that makes it very hard and very rigid to change. So we want to avoid that and do whatever we can to imply to our team that this is a learning experience, everything is living, and we're going to change things to find what works best for us as we go. And this doesn't just go for done criteria. I think this goes for about everything, whether it be backlogs, sprint plans, or even stories. The less formal we can make things, the more flexible it conveys to the team that we can change it to make it work. And finally, we want to keep our teams together. Now, sometimes this is out of a developer's hand, but it isn't always. Talk to your managers and try to discourage them from rapidly breaking apart and reforming the teams using the forming, storming, norming example that I mentioned today. Or if you find yourself in a place where the team does change, you can at least be aware of the phases that you'll need to go through each time. You can try to use this new awareness to help the team get to the next phase and get back to performing as soon as you can. Now, hopefully this webinar will help you on your way to building a great team. If you'd like to see more about how we can make Agile really work on your team, such as making Agile work with hard deadlines or even scaling Agile out to multiple teams, I'd like you to check out my Agile in the Real World course, where I break down a lot of the theory behind Agile and explain what does work and what doesn't work in the real world. Also, I've talked a lot today about talking through things with your customer to better understand your stories. But I realize that having a customer at your fingertips really isn't a reality for most Scrum teams. One of the skills you'll learn in this course is how you can work around having a missing or just a disengaged customer. If you happen to find yourself in a situation where your customer or your customer proxy just isn't as available as you'd like them to be. Now, if you'd like to learn more about how to write stories that let your team be productive as soon as they pick them up, check out the Creative Effective User Stories course. In this one, I show you a lot of real-world examples of how you can use Invest to whip stories into shape before the team picks them up, or how to define clear acceptance criteria for a story so you know what your customer wants before you start to work on the story instead of after. You probably noticed that one of the common themes today was simply just splitting bigger stories into smaller stories helps make a lot of the problems that we run into with stories simply a lot easier to overcome or go away entirely. Now, fortunately, sometimes it's not obvious how a bigger story can be broken down, so one of the things that you'll get from this course is step-by-step techniques for breaking large stories down into smaller stories so they're easier for your team to understand and to tackle. Now, both these courses are available from Pluralsight anytime. If you have any questions about anything I've talked about today, anything in these courses, or honestly anything about Agile in general, please don't hesitate to reach out to me through Twitter at JeremyJurl, or you can always get me through my website at www.jeremyjurl.com. This site also has a lot of the information about problems that teams face when they first implement Agile and how they can overcome them. So I'm happy to help you out in any way that I can, so please don't ever hesitate to reach out to me. Now, thank you all so much for taking the time to join me today, and I especially want to thank Pluralsight for being gracious enough to host this webinar for us. We still have a little time left, so I'd love to open up the floor to any questions you may have. So, Lindsay, do we have any questions?
Thanks, Jeremy. Yeah, we do. Let me go ahead and pull those up for you.
Okay.
Okay. I've got Roland asking a couple of questions here. I'll put them together. He wants to know who is responsible or accountable for having stories ready to cook. Since stories shouldn't include implementation, what measures can we take to ensure we're minimizing technical debt?
Oh, great question. So who's responsible for getting the stories ready to cook? So in a Scrum team, we usually have three roles. We have the Scrum Master, who's kind of responsible for nurturing the Scrum process and helping facilitate what it takes to get through the process. We have the development team, which is kind of just our, as I mentioned, what we consider our engineers, our testers, anyone who contributes to the product. And we have the product owner. And the product owner was actually who I refer to him a lot as a customer today, or a customer proxy, but the product owner is usually the person that really understands the market, understands what the customer needs, and it's kind of what we often think of as the business side of the business, who's really responsible for kind of helping the team decide what to build. So the product owner ideally is responsible for writing the user stories and getting them into a shape where they're ready to cook. What I've seen in most cases is that this works better if you have the Scrum Master, who's kind of your Scrum mentor in a lot of cases, working with the product owner to help them understand the invest criteria and help them understand which pieces of the criteria probably need to apply to each story. But the product owner is actually who really kind of holds the final say on what each story looks like and getting them into the final shape. And also, as a matter of fact, they also are the one who owns the final responsibility for the backlog and deciding what the team should be working on next. So to answer your question about how do we kind of keep the implementation details gated out of the story, by virtue that usually it's a product owner and a more business savvy person that's writing the story, that tends to kind of just emerge naturally. That's once we start focusing stories on the high level and the goals, the product owner and often with the Scrum Master's coaching isn't thinking too much about the implementation details, so they just tend not to emerge. If you do find yourself in a situation, sometimes a lead engineer will also work in those story writing sessions and help out. If you find yourself in a situation where implementation details do kind of start to seem to be leaking into the story, that's just a good opportunity for the Scrum Master to do a little coaching and kind of, again, just remind the more technical oriented people in that session that, hey, we really want to focus these stories on the high level, and also, remind them why. It's not just that we don't want to define the technical implementation. It's just that as much as we think that we know the best idea to approach this right now, when the rubber meets the road and we start coding this, we're going to learn a lot better ways. So we really want to keep those details out to the end.
Great, thank you. Michael is asking, are there any best practices in terms of running meetings for teams with members in different locations?
Oh, wow, great question. Yeah, so how do we run teams with remote members? It's definitely a tough one. I've actually worked on a lot of remote teams in the last few years, and it's definitely a challenge, but I think it's a challenge that we're only going to see more and more. So I think we need to solve it. So some of the things that I've seen, and those are the cases where I think teams really need to use an electronic board. A lot of times I kind of advise teams away from starting out with an electronic tracker like version 1 or Rally, and instead starting with physical tools. But I think that one of the things when you're working on these teams with remote members, you definitely need to be working off a remote board. I really encourage webcams, and it's amazing how big of a difference a webcam can make, and getting pictures in people, especially if you haven't met those people before, or if they happen to be maybe working for a consulting company that's in a different location. It's very easy when we only know someone from their name showing up on bug reports or on code commits to start to form unfair opinions about those people. However, getting webcams where you're actually talking to these people, interacting with them every day, at least getting pictures or avatars so you kind of know who they are, really helps fill in the gaps that they're really more than just, they're more than just a voice on the line. The other thing I would say too, before I go off that too much, is that actually social networking has actually kind of been a big boon for that, because actually just connecting with people that you don't see every day or don't work with every day on something like Facebook, where you start to kind of understand a little bit more about their life. And yes, this person does have a family. Yes, this person does have kids. They have interests outside of work. Really goes a long way to kind of taking them in your mind from this two-dimensional person who keeps finding bugs in your code or keeps checking in code that you're having to fix, to someone who's a real person that makes mistakes just like you. Just to return back to trying to run meetings and facilitate meetings with the remote team members. Yeah, the biggest thing that I would say is definitely use electronic tools. I like to run these meetings in conference rooms, and I would really discourage, when you're working at these conference rooms, or so when you're working through, like, say, a planning meeting where everyone is looking at the sprint backlog together, discourage the members that are all co-located from bringing their laptops and using their laptops, and instead just put it on a projector, and that kind of puts everyone on the same scale, or on the same footing as maybe the one individual that happens to be remote and is looking at the screen too. And the reason I say that is that when everyone's kind of looking at the same thing, even if someone's working remotely, it does tend to help to keep us on the same page a little more, and it also tends to discourage people from going off track. One other thing, this is fresh in my mind because I do a lot of remote teams. One other thing too I've learned that makes a big difference is, so I talked a lot about kind of keeping stories simple, keeping stories high level. I've actually found with remote teams that actually doesn't work as well. And you still want to avoid really over specifying stories and getting too detailed in, but a lot of times, especially if you're working on a time shifted team, which might be nearshore or offshore, and you only have a few hours with those individuals, or a few hours overlap with those individuals every day, you really want to get more detail. Get some more detail in those stories. So if they run into a question about how something should be implemented or how something should be done, they're not stuck until the main team comes in the next morning. So you actually, even as much as I kind of say, hey, we want to keep stories simple, keep them high level. When working with remote teams, it's actually one place where you depart from that a little bit, in the sense that you want to think about, okay, well, if this person can't talk to us for the next 6 hours, what information are they going to need to know? And honestly, but also applying the invest criteria to really trying to shake out as many of those questions as possible before a developer picks them up goes a long way towards that. Yeah, that's a great question, though. That's definitely a big issue more and more every day.
That's great advice. I have Jason asking a question. Do you have any tips for how to integrate a QA team into the Agile process? Do their bugs get handled in the current sprint or pushed to the next one? How do you optimize dev and QA productivity in these situations?
Great question. Sit them together. That's the biggest thing I've seen, if they happen to be co-located. And this also comes back to kind of what I mentioned before when you're working with remote teams. But I've noticed that with development teams, that there tends to be a natural tension that evolves between developers and testers because, frankly, we don't want to say they're at odds with each other. But if you're not talking to these people, you're not talking to these people every day and not really kind of realizing you're at the same goal, it starts to look like that. So we want to get them together, get them working together as soon as as much as possible, so people know each other. As far as that helps with the integrating. What I also say is always have the testers in the planning meetings. When you're doing the script planning, when you're doing the estimating, the testers, a test engineer will estimate just right alongside the developer. And I kind of alluded to this a little bit when I talked about in Scrum that we call it a development team, but that's an all-encompassing term for engineers, testers, designers, whatever. So whenever we're doing the planning, testers, engineers, designers all estimate side by side, and what we try to get is an estimate that takes into account what everyone's impact is going to be. So if we're working on a particular story, like say the login form, we don't want someone to think about, oh well, if this is probably only a 1-point story for coding, but this is probably a 2-point story for testing. Instead, we want to really think about, okay, this is a 3-point story. We want everyone to kind of think about that they're in this together and they're working in this together. Now, as far as prioritizing those bugs in the current sprint, what I do is I do something called a bug budget, and the way a bug budget works is that you basically carve off a percentage of your velocity every sprint that you're going to focus on bugs or technical debt, something like that. So let's imagine that you have a team that's doing 10 points per sprint. We might decide that we're going to carve off 30% for a bug budget. And what happens is that when the team plans their sprint that time, they might only pick up 7 points worth of new stories, but then they'll also take the 3 points of whatever the most high priority bugs are that they work with. And that helps because that helps the team from becoming overwhelmed with the bug, becoming overwhelmed with the outstanding bugs, and we kind of keep things in pace. Now, if anything comes in, the rule I've always used, if anything comes in critical from production that has to be dealt with, we have to be dealt with. I mean, we never want, if the website goes down and no one can log in, we never want to tell someone, oh, well, that's great, it'll take 2 weeks until we can get to the next set of stories to work on it. I mean, if something's critical, we deal with it then. But a lot of things, once we really think about it, really aren't. And also, once you've built this level of trust up with your business owners and your stakeholders, that when I say we're going to work on it in 2 weeks, we really are going to work on it in 2 weeks. A lot of things that used to be very critical become much less critical because they understand that yes, it will really be worked on. So that helps. The other two things I'd mention here. So the way I've always treated is that any bugs that emerge from the sprint, like on a new story. So let's say I'm a developer, I implement my login screen. I work with the tester to define the test cases, and she goes off and tests that screen, and she comes back and says, "Hey, this works great, but if I just hit enter with no password, it takes me right in. That's a bug." And instead of filing that as a separate bug, I simply don't consider that story finished, and I just go back to it. So the story just gets reopened. So that's how I like to handle stories that handle bugs that occur in the same sprint. We just treat it as part of the same story. The other thing I wanted to touch on was I talked about the bug budget. Sometimes that can be a bit of a hard pill to swallow. And when you say to someone, oh yeah, you say to a stakeholder, we can do 10 points a sprint, but we're only going to do 7 points for new development because we have this backlog of technical debt or bugs or chores that we have to get through, so we're going to save some time off. So that doesn't always go great the first time. So what helps there is an analogy. I always draw the analogy to financials, and I think about the sense that, like, okay, let's imagine that I get paid $1,000 every 2 weeks. Well, not every $1,000 is going to go straight into my checking account to go buy toys with. I'm going to, out of that $1,000, I might put put $300 back towards my taxes. I might put $400 toward my house to pay back long-term, like my long-term mortgage and long-term debt. I might put $200 back to to pay back short-term debt like a credit card, and that might leave with $400 or whatever. And that's the amount of money that I really have then to go and to buy new stuff with. And most business people and stakeholders they're much more comfortable with that analogy that yes, just because we have all this capacity or all this resources to work with doesn't mean we can throw everything at it, because if we do, we're eventually going to lose our house. We're eventually going to be crumbled or crushed under a mountain of debt, and things are going to catch up with us. So starting with that analogy and thinking about each point as essentially money that we work with every sprint and how we're investing that different money in different buckets can help that a lot.
Awesome. So many good questions coming in. Unfortunately, I think we only have time for one more, so I'm going to throw this one to you from Khan. He asks, what about the technical debt that reaches beyond the team's capacity, things that might be in a different technical level, such as the server backend, etc.? Is there a role that manages these kinds of issues, or do you expect the Scrum Master to be part of different teams and coordinate that as well?
Oh wow, Colin, that's a great question. So what happens? What happens essentially when you have a resource or a dependency that that is outside the team's control? So a lot of times the Scrum Master's role, first and foremost in the team, is to remove impediments on the team. So if it's a situation where maybe for example like the development team has completed a feature and they say, hey, it's great, but we can't get this into testing because the operations team hasn't provisioned a test server for us. That onus really becomes Scrum Master's responsibility, or that comes on the Scrum Master's shoulders to go and to do whatever he needs to do to get that done and to remove that blocker for the team. So in the sense, if it's more of an organizational blocker, then it's probably more the Scrum Master's responsibility in that sense. As far as like how the Scrum Master coordinates that, what a lot of organizations will do is they start to scale to multiple teams. Is they'll have the idea of a scrum of scrums. And the way the scrum of scrums works is, let's imagine that I have a development department with 21 engineers, or 21 developers, and I've split those over 3 scrum teams evenly. So what will happen is I'll probably have a scrum master on each team, and then in each team will kind of have their morning planning, will have their sprints, everything like that, and then once or twice a week, the scrum masters from each of those teams would get together and kind of have their own morning scrum and talk about. And this is where a lot of those coordination issues will emerge. And this might be where the scrum master for the login team would talk to the operations team and say, hey, my guys have been trying to get a test server provisioned. There's something holding it up. What can we do to help that happen? And having those meetings a couple of times a week that kind of give you the chance to bubble up those issues that are outside of a team's control but are blocking them is a great way to do that. The other thing I would say is that as far as when you're dealing with technical resources in general, the DevOps movement really has been great to this, and it's made a lot of great strides to us from getting us away from thinking about maybe the operations team in their own silo and feature and coding teams in their own other silos, and instead thinking about the feature teams and the coding teams being a lot more involved in the operations. Whether that means there's someone who's particularly strong with operations that becomes a full-time member of a Scrum team, and then they're there, they have the connections, they have the knowledge to make those changes happen, or or the Scrum team itself is just responsible for their entire infrastructure. Just so that entire DevOps movement has really gone a lot to really help that. There's a great book that came out, I believe, about 2 years ago called The Phoenix Project. I'm sorry, the author's name escapes me right now, but the Phoenix Project essentially is all about how an organization broke down their silos and rebuilt everything in the image of DevOps. So instead of having this operation team that becomes a natural bottleneck for all the other teams because they just have so much of a backlog of things to get through, really kind of spreading that functionality across the development teams and feature teams. And there's a lot of great information, a lot of great ideas in there about how you can start to make kind of small gains in your organization to kind of shift towards that model where where instead of the operations team kind of being its own team that's kind of at the mercy of the other teams, to where the different development teams start to take a little bit more responsibility and then are less are kind of less blocked by having to wait on things to be provisioned. So.
Awesome. Well, I believe we are just out of time. Unfortunately, we did not get to everyone's questions today. However, as Jeremy stated, you can find him on jeremygerald.com or at his Twitter handle at jeremygerald. Thank you, Jeremy, so much. That's all the time we have left. Thank you, everyone, for participating. If you have comments or feedback, you can also email us here at webinars@pluralsight.com. This webinar was recorded, and we'll email the link in a few days. Remember to tweet about your experience today and continue the conversation with #PluralsightLive for a chance to win a free month of training. And remember, as you leave, please fill out our survey. Thank you again. Have a wonderful day.